Welcome to ECWOR's webinar on SOC 2. We're here to discuss kind of three key values. One, from our marketing, how important it is and the trust for a customer. Two, the framework it offers. And three, how it improves your process and the audit fatigue. Yeah. My name is Alex Liu, Chief Security Officer at ECWORks. Welcome Ray, who used to work for Deloitte, and we did our first audit for Web Trust. And then from there, we've worked together from other audits, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Ray Van Krimpen. I'm a partner at Richter. I've been practicing in the area of information security and privacy for well over 20 years. I've conducted many SOC 2 reports over my career, probably more than 150. And EchoWorks has been one of them for many years. I've always enjoyed working with Alex and his team and helping them to stay compliant. Looking forward to our discussion today.
When you talk about SOC 2, there's different types of SOC certification, and then also SOC 2 and other compliance have similarities. Perhaps, Ray, you can expand on the difference between Type 1, Type 2, and how SOC 2 differs from an auditability, from an ISO certification or a PCI.
Thanks. It's an area that I often like to talk about because quite often when clients are approaching us, they're coming to us with compliance needs for a service level agreement that they might have with a key customer. And oftentimes we see a bunch of different types of compliance being thrown in. So it'll say something within the terms and conditions of this service level agreement that the service provider needs to provide a PCI or an ISO 27001 report or SOC 2. And oftentimes it's not really providing enough specificity of the type of assurance that that particular organization is looking for. So it's good to understand the differences between the two. So starting with a SOC 2, there are two types of SOC 2. There's a Type 1 and a Type 2. The Type 1 is really a point in time. So it's looking at whether the controls have been designed and implemented. It gives you some level of assurance, but there's a greater level of assurance that comes with a Type 2. The Type 2 covers a period of time, typically 12 months. And what that gives us is some indication that management is not only designed and implemented those controls, but they're operating those controls on an effective basis over a period of time. So they're demonstrating their capability of doing that. Now, when we get into different types of reports or types of certification, let's take ISO 27001 for example. At the end of the day, you get a certificate. Typically, an ISO 27001 is following the ISO 27001 framework for controls, but the type of auditing that the auditor will do is typically a point in time. So they're just looking for the design and implementation of that control. Oftentimes, if there's something missing, you can still get an ISO 27001 certificate as long as management and their information system management system has got plans to improve that area of control. In a SOC 2, either a Type 1 or a Type 2, if the control has not been implemented and designed, it will result in some form of audit qualification. The report's still issued, but it's not a fully clean report, one that a corresponding auditor might look at and take full reliance on. When we get into things like PCI, again, PCI covers typically a point in time. It's much more prescriptive than a SOC 2. SOC 2 takes the trust services criteria from AICPA and CPA Canada, and it provides a number of illustrative controls. So it's not quite as prescriptive as PCI.
I've been working with a lot of the top banks in North America. We have customers, and they require SOC 2 Type 2. And what's key is your audit on what you say you do, right? SOC gives the framework to give customers that you have the structure, but the Type 2 is key to say you're doing what you're saying. And what I find is a lot of customers that review organization, they'll only have type 1, and that's not sufficient now. It was sufficient years ago, but the accountability is really important from an organization. I'm not too sure if you've seen that with other organizations or.
Yeah, I mean, typically an organization going through their first SOC 2 will endeavor to do a type 1 because it's useless to do a test of operating effectiveness if the controls haven't been designed and implemented in the first place. But you're right. People are starting to understand the differences between a type 1 and type 2, and anybody's looking for, I guess, a greater level of assurance will be looking for a type 2 because, again, it demonstrates that management's not just written that these controls and implemented them, but they're actually good at effectively following them. And I think that provides any organization that's relying on the controls of you as a third-party service provider a level of comfort that they won't necessarily get. And that's a big difference between what we were discussing earlier between an ISO 27001 certification and even PCI. PCI might be more prescriptive and have some, it says something to the effect that, cardholder data must be encrypted and in transit and at rest. SOC 2 may not be as prescriptive as that, but the fact that it's testing the operating effectiveness of your controls gives it a much stronger indication of how well the organization is adhering to a set of controls.
And that's key, having a third party validate. It's easy in an organization to say, we do it, and document a process and say, this is sufficient, but it may not be sufficient. You need someone else to look at it and say, have you missed? Is there a gap, right? So.
Right. And I think when you're dealing with a seasoned auditor in this space too, oftentimes they can bring advice around how other organizations have done those controls. Because, not all organizations are the same size, complexity, or have the same security and data challenges that, another organization might have. But when you get to see how other organizations are doing it across a wider industry benchmark, you can oftentimes bring very good, solid, practical recommendations to the organizations that you're auditing, so that they can adopt those controls in a really efficient manner.
One thing I've noticed also in the industry, organizations are saying we're SOC 1, SOC 2, but it's not really the organization. A lot of new vendors who are going to the cloud market are using, like us, AWS Data Center, and they're certified SOC 2, but their organization isn't. So you need to be careful when you source your software vendor that they are SOC compliant versus just their data center, because it doesn't ensure the process is there.
Yeah, I've seen that quite a few times. People claim to be SOC 2, Type 2 compliant because they're using an AWS data center or AWS cloud, and they just take the report and they'll pass it along. I'm like, well, we're on AWS cloud, so we're certified too by that means. And well, that does, there is some advantage to that for sure. And kudos for those organizations for picking a cloud platform that does have a SOC 2 and can attest to the controls. It's what you do on that platform that I think is of more concern for the organization that's acquiring your services. They want to make sure that you've got good change management in place, that you've got good security monitoring in place, and all of the different types of areas of control that we typically look at under a SOC 2. It's important to really talk about things in terms of the scope and the framework and what's being included in the SOC 2. That system description is very important, and oftentimes I think people are not reading the system description fully to understand what the scope of the SOC 2 is, and that's that's something that the very early stages of getting an organization prepared for a SOC 2, we spend quite a bit of time with our clients like EchoWorks to make sure that that description is a fair representation of what the organization's services are to the public.
I find perhaps you can go into more details what the framework covers, And then once you pass or certify, you don't really need to ask the vendor for their more details of every dot.
Now you raise up a good point, and I've seen this time and time again from different perspectives, and that's people understanding how, like, what goes into a SOC 2 report and how to read it, right? And so I'll dive a little deeper on that. So there's two main components to a SOC 2 report as I see it. There's one, the foundation of which we're testing the controls, and that's usually the trust services criteria. And there's a bunch of different criteria to test against, everything from privacy to processing integrity, confidentiality, availability, and privacy. Most organizations will do the common criteria, which is really the security criteria as at least the bare bones, which is an extensive set of controls. It's a great framework for an organization to even self-assess themselves against if they're considering going the SOC 2 route. Now, there's another part to a SOC 2, and that's the guidelines for the auditor and how to audit. And there's a pretty extensive amount of work that goes in behind the scenes on a SOC 2, as far as the testing that we do, the samples that we collect, the levels of scrutiny that the evidence goes through in accordance to the tests that we create against those controls, but also a lot of management review within the firm itself to make sure that it's meeting those particular standards. In Canada, it's the CSAE 3000 standards that we follow. In the US, there's different ones, but combined, AICPA, CPA Canada, trust services criteria with the guidelines on how to do the audit, it's a pretty extensive endeavor to undertake a SOC 2, and there's a lot that goes into it. But for someone who's just receiving a SOC 2, who's never been on maybe the side of having gone through a SOC 2 from an auditee perspective or from having been an auditor, they may not understand everything that goes into it, and they're looking at a report that may not show all the details that the auditor went through. And that's by design. Partly because even though a SOC 2 is a restricted report, it's not something you post on your internet. You might, mention on your website that you have done a SOC 2 type 2 or something to that effect, but you're not going to post it there and share it with the world. And the reason for that is because we do put quite a bit of information in the description that, put into the wrong hands, would really help a hacker from the sort of scoping and targeting aspect. And so we're pretty careful about who we share SOC 2 reports with. But even on that note, the level of detail that we put in a SOC 2 type 2, say in the testing section, should give you an idea of what has been tested, but it's not going to show you all of the samples and precisely all of the nuances of the controls that we've tested. It has to be at a certain level that provides an educated reader with the sense of the rigor that went into it, but not giving out all of the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Let's take a report, for example, and talk about, when you're reading it, some of the key things that you should be looking for, right? So in the audit opinion, what you'll see is some language from the auditor that will give an opinion on whether the framework or the criteria that are part of a SOC 2, mainly the trust services criteria, were put in place and have been operating effectively by the organization. And the opinion is usually one that's of the nature that will say, in our opinion, we didn't see any evidence that management has not met these criteria. So it's kind of like it's set out like that. But if an organization didn't have the controls in place and were sort of failing things miserably, you wouldn't see a report that just says fail. That doesn't look like that. What you do is you get a negative audit opinion where we would say something to the effect of, most of these controls we've seen are put in place and operating effectively, except for these. And then we'll bring up. Now, an audit qualification is really on the criteria itself, not on the individual controls. The individual controls kind of roll up to support that set of suitable audit criteria. So the opinion is really on the criteria, which is something I think a lot of people don't understand sometimes, because what you can have in a Type 2 report in the section that shows where the testing is, you may have some exceptions, right? And it may not result in a negative opinion or a qualified opinion in the audit report. It really depends on how many of those controls are not functioning, the extent of those controls, and how they roll up into the criteria. If it's gotten to a point where those controls can no longer support the criteria, then it results in a qualified audit opinion. But nobody should be surprised to see a SOC 2 Type 2 with some exceptions. And oftentimes it's human error,
Yes.
that kind of thing. When somebody's reviewing that report, they might look at those exceptions and look at how that might have impact on the risk to their particular organization. So, for example, let's talk about user access management, for example. Typically what we see in organizations, and as far as control, there's a formalized access provisioning and deprovisioning set of controls, right? And let's say we sampled, based on frequency, we sampled 10 throughout the year of, new users that had come on board. And we noticed that, some of them, maybe, 2 out of the 10, there wasn't proper documentation and proper approvals that had been documented. That's going to show up, but we're looking at a whole bunch of other, complementary controls that make up that particular criteria. And we have, a small discrepancy there, but all of the rest of the controls that we were looking for, the policy, the governance, access reviews, and a whole set of other different controls might mitigate that to the point where we say the criteria is reasonably met, can still be reasonably met. So,
yeah. What I find interesting when I read a SOC report, or what I look for, is what you mentioned, the exceptions, right? And they could be minor, and that's fine. But what I also look is what's not included, because I notice, and you've mentioned this to me, some organization will carve a section out to be compliant, and they won't mention it. So they'll say this is not included. So it's important that you read, the SOC report, or find out for the service you want, is it included, right? This is really important, right? You go to these vendors and they say we're compliant, but they may not be for your business needs. They carve that section. Maybe you could expand on that.
Well, I mean, it goes to our earlier discussion around having a good system description, and part of it is the responsibility of the auditor too. The auditor should never be issuing a report that might misrepresent the organization, even from a scoping perspective. So, like when we take on a new client, well, you've been a client of ours for quite a while, but even when we went through that process of developing your SOC 2, we had to look at it through the lens of this is going to be shared with umpteen people. It's a restricted report, but we don't know who it's going to be shared with. And so it's our job as the auditor to make sure that there's a fair representation of the service that you're sharing with your clients. And so that might come in with, in that description, some descriptions of scope limitation as well, to say, this is not part of it. For example, sometimes you get into an organization that may have a shared managed service. Maybe they're managing a bunch of applications for different organizations, and there may be some nuance to organization A versus organization B. And so some of those nuances between those organizations, they might have separate service level agreements, can't be really included in the SOC 2 unless we get really, really precise on some of those things. Then we have to name clients, and that's typically what we don't want to do in a SOC 2 type 2 report. What we want to do is we want to give a description that's going to be informational enough that people can understand the controls that are put in place, but also generic enough that they can apply to many different of your clients and or prospects questions about controls as well. Yeah.
One other thing I've noticed in the SOC process of compliance, pen test is a recommendation, and it helps for the audit.
Yeah.
I always wonder why it's not a requirement.
I mean, that's one of the I guess pros and cons of a SOC 2 is that it doesn't stipulate controls as precisely as you must do a vulnerability assessment, right? But what we do see is most organizations will adopt that as best practice because, like, quite frankly, most of the organizations that we're doing SOC 2s for are in some sort of SaaS type of solution, cloud-based solution. There's a lot of nuances to the security in those applications. And so if you're not at least having some sort of vulnerability assessment done at the web application level of those particular SaaS solutions, how can you really be sure, right? And so I don't have many clients that have a SOC 2 that they're not doing some sort of pen test or vulnerability assessment. Like, it kind of becomes not a stipulated requirement, but it gets best practice, right?
Yeah.
So you should do it. And the organizations that we're doing these SOC 2 reports for, I would say, I'd have a hard time finding one that's not doing it. And it might be some unique circumstances to the solution that they're providing that you would say, okay, I can see why you might not want to have a vulnerability assessment here, but the precise example is not coming off the top of my head.
Yeah, for EchoWorks, what I found really important with from a SOC 2 is the audit. It ensures or makes sure that we are accountable, because I noticed, having the process and saying you do it in verbal is very different than tracking it. And, so a SOC 2, from my perspective, is really important because of the auditability, and then learning from the mistakes. A year later, you missed it. What happened? And by noticing where you missed it, you reduce your risk in your organization that somebody can, circumvent the process.
Yeah. I guess it's a question of maturity. Like when you think of like a lot of organizations that get into SaaS services, usually they're kind of coming from like a startup culture and stuff like that, where it's a very small team, and that's not to say that the people there aren't thinking about security, but it's kind of oftentimes put a little bit off to the wayside because they're really focused on the business and growing the business and creating functionality within their solution, and they're not thinking about controls up front. And then suddenly they get their first big client, and it's like, oh, I've got to get a SOC 2. How am I going to do that? And so they'll typically engage a firm like ours to say, well, give us a quote. What's this going to take? And what we like to do is to walk people through a process and say, look, if you're not familiar with the trust services criteria for SOC 2, better get familiar with it, understand what's involved with it. And so we'll take them through a bit of a readiness assessment prior to doing the SOC 2. And that gives them a little bit of an eye-opening experience, so to speak. The framework is key, though, right?
Yes.
Because I think you're looking at all the things, and you know the pieces of security, in their little particular, in their particular areas, right? But when you have to sort of pull it all together, that's where a framework comes in and can really help an organization find those gaps where, they might be doing a few things really well, but then have they considered these other areas, and they start to realize, that those areas are important as well.
But what's changed now is there's an expectation for service provider to have it. It's a little different. For instance, for insurance, they require for us, actually, our insurance to provide. We're SOC 2 or our sub provider. They just want the document. They don't go into details what they just require it. So it's it's different now. Even our accounting. The finance will ask me, I need your SOC 2 report for your organization. I need it for your data center. So I think there's a shift from 5 or 10 years ago. Do an assessment, improve your systems, right? But now to do business with any major banks that we deal with in North America or Europe, they expect it minimum, right? And then beyond that, when they want the details, they expect that your organization has minimum what our organization has, regardless SOC or PCI. And for us, we've enhanced a lot of our process beyond PCI because it's expected, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that trend that you're seeing is a trend I've definitely seen too. I've done some work in the larger institutions in Canada as well, and what I've seen happen over time is that their vendor management processes have certainly gotten a lot better. So, and they're starting to recognize that they can get various certifications, things like the SOC 2, to help enhance their understanding of their third-party risk, right? So I think with the maturation that we've seen in the institutions, both government and the finance sector, the banking sector, there's been a growing understanding of and acceptance of third-party assurance reports to help organizations get a hold of their third-party risk. So that's definitely a trend that I've seen. And I mean, it kind of comes in hand with the advent of cloud and more SaaS applications out there too, that organizations, stuff they used to do in-house, they're seeing they can do it out through, a myriad of great applications that are out there in the cloud and in the SaaS space. And so why wouldn't they adopt them for their organization? There's so many benefits to it. The resiliency that's typically built into SaaS, the elasticity of the cloud, being able to grow your use of a particular application and shrink it as needed is really great. So many advantages to that. So you can see why organizations are going more and more to third parties to use those capabilities. But at the same time, it doesn't absolve them from the risk until they manage that through a proper third-party risk management program. And a SOC 2 can be, one indicator of the risk of that particular third party.
How do you distinguish one auditor versus another?
Yeah,
I'm just kind of curious, right? Like been asked.
It's a great question, Alex. It's one I struggle with from the perspective of I've got a lot of competition out there, right? And so of course I'm going to have my biased opinion on this. I would say it depends on the relationship you're looking to get out of the auditor too. There's a lot of low-cost auditors that will come in, go through the motions of a SOC 2 report. I question sometimes whether they fully do what they need to do. And the interesting thing is, like in our audit profession, there are auditors of auditors too, right? Mm-hmm. So in Canada, we have CPAB, which kind of looks over and comes in and audits the audit firms to make sure that when they're doing, financial audits and assurance reports, they're following the standards as they should. And so you would expect that a SOC 2, provided by Richter or any number of the big four, like a Deloitte or a PwC, would sort of follow the same rigor, and it should. According to the standards, it should. But the risk of going with like a lower cost sort of almost drive-by auditor, I hate to say that, but we jokingly refer to it sometimes as that, because we know what goes into testing, and you've seen it because
Yes.
you're on the side of the auditee, and so you know the rigor that we go through when we're asking for evidence and asking you and sitting there and observing things and corroborating the evidence with other pieces of evidence and things that you might be telling us. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it, and sometimes it boggles my mind, how these low cost providers can come in and actually do a thorough report. And then what has happened is we've actually taken over from some of those low cost providers, and so we find out a little bit about them and how they operate, and we hear lots of different stories. Sometimes the auditors that are assigned to the file are not very experienced. They're following a little bit of a checklist. They don't take the time to really understand the organization's business and the nuance that comes with that over control. But the other side of it is I also believe that they're not providing that sort of additional value of when you're coming up to a particular control, which you may need to strengthen or enhance. The practical advice isn't always there, right? It's not fit for your organization. Like maybe something comes in very high level, and you're kind of left to your own devices to figure that out. So we always see ourselves. Obviously we have to be independent, but we also see ourselves as a strong, trusted advisor to our clients, right? I would say a partner exactly, but along those lines, a trusted advisor where you can. And so I think when you're taking a look at looking for a SOC 2 auditor, you got to keep that in mind. Like, and you can get that from asking for references from their clients, and I've asked you to be a reference many times for and I always appreciate that. So that's something to consider. So Alex, you've been getting a SOC 2 for a number of years, and I know EchoWorks on their website, talks about the different levels of assurance that they provide their clients through things like PCI and SOC 2. What can you tell me about the marketing value for EchoWorks on having those particular reports and certifications?
So it's just the beginning of the journey. But the more you have these credentials, the more customers believe what you're doing is what you're saying.
Right.
So
it helps to establish that immediate level of trust.
yes.
That you're not just some fly-by-night security software company, that you've actually, what you're doing in this space, and you've got the credentials to match it. And so it gives them a level of trust, right?
Definitely. Right.
I could see that.
Yeah.
That is one of the values that SOC 2 was originally designed on too, is to provide a larger swath of particularly users of users of the services of an organization some level of trust. And it reminds me of a story quite a few years ago. It wasn't EchoWorks, it was another client, but I won't say which client it was, of course. But we had been auditing this organization for a few years, and they had a new employee, and so it was his first time being audited by us. And he said this to me. He said, I came to this new organization, and they do things differently here. They document everything, and it's because of this audit. And he goes, it's a real pain, but I've got my weekends back. I'm not fighting fires like I was at the last organization, because these guys are they're documenting everything. They're so formal about these things that things don't get missed. And so things that get missed that, end up creating those situations where you're coming in on the weekend to fix something because not everybody did what they were supposed to do on the systems to maintain the control, whether it's a change management issue or an access management issue. So it's the discipline that comes around with it. I think there's some true value to it. People might roll their eyes and say, "Oh, controls, it's a lot of like this guy did." He said it's a pain, but I see why we're doing it. Have you found that by having a SOC 2, you still get a lot of inquiries, right?
Mhm.
But does it help reduce the number of inquiries that you get when you can hand them a SOC 2? A SOC 2
Yeah.
is not going to stop all the inquiries from happening. And we talked a little bit earlier about when you do hand it over, it
Mhm.
has to go to someone who actually knows what they're looking at. But
Yeah.
has it helped you reduce the amount of evidence that you have to provide above and beyond the SOC 2?
Oh, it definitely has. Having this, EchoWorks has an engagement team and a pre-sales. By having this, the questions are less. So they'll provide this as an evidence initially. The security, the process, right? What comes after is the more detailed questions, specific, so they can map it to their process or their requirements. Each organization, but without this, what you end up doing is providing an audit again. Because they're auditing you and everything
I
again.
got you.
Every sections. Are you monitoring? Where's your monitoring document? Or have you done a pen test, for instance? Or where's your disaster recovery? Prove to us you have it. Show us a document. So by doing this audit, I don't provide any of my internal documents anymore.
Yeah.
The audit says we do it, right? The issue is some security people don't understand what the audit is, right? But for those who do, okay, we're all fine. But we need to know this specific detail. Does your BCP cover remote development? So if you're off, they want specific because it's tied to what their organization has to impose on their supplier. But definitely.
Yeah, I got you. So what it's really, in fact, doing is it may not cover like 100% of those requests, but it's reducing it by, say 80%. And then when those sort of 20% that they're still asking, they're probably better questions, right?
Yes.
Because they've looked at a SOC 2, they've read it, they know what you have, and they can be a little bit more fine-tuned on what they're asking for.
Definitely.
So I think, that's a really good example of how it can reduce audit fatigue. It can't get rid of all of those other audit questions, unfortunately, but definitely has an impact on reducing the audit fatigue.
Thank you for all attending. I hope this webinar was helpful. And thank you, Ray, for coming aboard and providing your knowledge, from an auditing and I know you have besides, SOC 2 audits, you do PCI audits, you do web trust and, GDPR compliance, so you have a range of expertise and experience that actually has helped us from a SOC 2 because the other kind of information gets passed into in the process. So
yeah, well, and that's what we try to bring to all of our engagements. And thank you for having me here to discuss this with you today. I always like the opportunity to help further educate. So hoping people watching this today learn a little bit more about SOC 2 and what it means, and they walk away with some aha moments to say, okay, now I get what this thing is and how I can leverage and what kind of reliance I can put on it. But always appreciative. Always love doing work with EchoWorks, and thank you again.